A room filled with noise, the morning bustle of Riverside Trust Bank echoed with the sounds of clicking heels, murmurs of clients, the hum of printers, and the occasional ding of the security door. The bank sat on the corner of Ashbury Street, its marble floor polished so sharply it reflected every overhead light like a mirror. To the average passerby, it looked like an ordinary institution, orderly, efficient, unyielding. But to those inside, it was a theater of wealth and hierarchy. At the center of it all stood Victor Halden, the branch manager. His laugh was booming. His suits always tailored half a size too tight to emphasize his gym-built shoulders. He lived for these morning rushes when he could hold court over the floor, tossing jokes and snide comments that drew laughter from staff eager to stay on his good side. To him, the bank wasn't just a workplace. It was his stage. That morning, he spotted her. She wasn't dressed like the other clients, no pearl necklaces, no silk ties, no leather briefcases. Instead, she wore a faded gray coat frayed at the cuffs. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair neatly tied back but without the gloss of a professional stylist. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather folder, the kind that had seen decades of handling. Victor's lips curled into a smirk. An easy target had walked into his kingdom, the spark of ridicule. "If your account has a balance," Victor declared loudly enough for half the lobby to hear, "I'll give you my whole month's salary." His words cut through the hum of activity like a thrown glass. Several customers chuckled, glancing at the woman. A pair of tellers behind the counter bit their lips, stifling grins. Even a security guard near the door shook his head, amused. Victor wasn't finished. He leaned his elbows on the counter and spoke again, louder this time. "Look at her, clutching that old folder like it's treasure. Probably thinks this is some kind of community center. Newsflash, sweetheart, we don't do food stamps here." A ripple of laughter rolled through the room. A woman waiting near the door smirked and shook her head. One of the younger bankers whispered something to his colleague, earning a suppressed giggle. The target of his cruelty, Grace Alston, stood perfectly still. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, her chin slightly raised. She didn't fumble, didn't shrink, didn't meet the mocking eyes around her. Instead, she let her gaze rest evenly on Victor, her silence steady against the noise. The quiet fire Grace's cheeks burned, not from shame, but from something sharper, deeper. It was a familiar fire, one she had felt as a teenager in private school hallways where whispers followed her every step. She had felt it in her early 20s, standing in boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else. She had felt it at gala dinners where strangers assumed she was staff, not the honored guest. But she had learned long ago. Silence was a weapon. Her fingers tightened slightly on the worn folder. Inside were documents older than most of the staff in the building. She drew a slow, deep breath, cooling the fire in her chest until it turned into something steadier. Then, with calm precision, she spoke. "I'm here to access a legacy account. I have the documentation. I would appreciate it if someone could assist me." "Escalation legacy account," Victor scoffed theatrically, turning to the other clients like an actor breaking the fourth wall. "She thinks she has a legacy account." More chuckles. He gestured broadly toward Grace, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Lady, you're in the wrong zip code for legacies. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a bank." The laughter was louder this time. One teller shook her head, trying not to smile. A young couple in line exchanged amused glances. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, harsher. "We don't run a shelter here. We serve real clients. If you're looking to cash a paycheck from some temp job, you'd better try the grocery store down the street." He flicked his hand toward the door like swatting away a fly. "Now move along." But Grace didn't move. The breaking point something in her stillness unnerved him. Victor's amusement curdled into irritation. He slammed his palm against the counter, making a few papers flutter. "I said, get out." And before anyone could react, he shoved her by the shoulder. Gasps rang out. Grace stumbled, her balance slipping. The folder in her hands flew open, spilling its contents across the polished floor. Yellowed deposit slips, notarized letters, identification papers, even a faded photograph. They scattered like leaves in a storm. Grace landed on one knee, her breath caught in her throat. The lobby fell silent. No more laughter, no more smirks. Just the quiet shock of a line crossed too far. A hand. "Extended, ma'am." "Let me help you." The voice broke the silence. It belonged to Daniel Reyes, one of the youngest bankers at the branch, barely 26. He rushed forward from his desk, kneeling beside Grace as he gently collected the papers. His hands moved quickly but carefully as though handling fragile glass. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Grace nodded once. Her palms were scraped from the fall, but her composure remained unbroken. She gathered the folder back into her hands with dignity, her movements precise. Daniel then stood and extended a hand. For a moment she considered it, then accepted, rising gracefully to her feet. From across the lobby, Victor barked, "Daniel, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Daniel turned, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "I'm doing my job, sir." She asked to verify an account. "That's all," Victor sneered. "She doesn't have an account. She's faking it. Don't waste your time." Daniel glanced at Grace, then back at his manager. "She has documentation. I have no reason to dismiss her without checking." The room shifted. The audience of customers and staff, once complicit in their silence, now watched with narrowed eyes, their laughter replaced with discomfort. Grace adjusted her coat, her posture unbroken, and followed Daniel toward a consultation desk. The first glimpse, Daniel typed her name carefully into the system. Grace Eleanor Alston. The screen blinked, then pulsed with a red alert. Founders Class Tier 1 verification. Do not proceed without oversight. Daniel froze. His eyes darted to Grace, then back to the screen. A string of numbers appeared, figures that made his breath hitch. 8 figures, active, verified. Victor, who had stormed after them, loomed behind Daniel. "Well, what now? Her little piggy bank show $5? Daniel slowly turned the screen so Victor could see. Victor's face drained of color. And for the first time all morning, he had nothing to say. The weight of silence. The moment Victor's eyes landed on the figures glowing from Daniel's screen, the smugness drained from his face as though someone had pulled a curtain away from the sun. He stood frozen, his jaw tightening, lips pressed into a hard line, but no words came. The silence that followed was louder than any of his booming jests had been minutes earlier. The customers in line shifted uneasily, unsure whether to look at Grace, Daniel, or the man who only moments ago had been the loudest voice in the room. Grace herself remained perfectly composed, her folder once again secure in her hands, her chin lifted, her gaze calm but unwavering. There was no gloating, no triumphant smile, no bitterness seeping through her expression. Her quiet dignity was a kind of strength that none of them had expected. Least of all Victor. Daniel, still standing beside her, felt a knot in his stomach tighten as he realized the magnitude of what he had just uncovered. The system was clear. This was not an ordinary account, not even a privileged one reserved for wealthy clients. This was a founder's class account, the kind that tied directly to the very roots of the bank's history. The red alerts that had popped up on his screen were warnings reserved for only the highest level of accounts. Accounts that carried not just money, but legacy, authority, and weight in the institution itself. He glanced at Grace again, the realization dawning more heavily by the second that the woman Victor had shoved. Mocked and humiliated was not a desperate wanderer with an empty folder, but someone with ties far deeper than most of them could imagine. Victor leaned closer, his voice a strained whisper meant only for Daniel but audible to those nearest. "This has to be some kind of mistake. Run it again." Daniel hesitated but shook his head. "The system doesn't make this kind of mistake, sir. The alerts are locked. Her name matches exactly. This is a verified founder's account." His tone carried none of Victor's arrogance, only the clarity of someone stating undeniable fact. Grace finally spoke, her voice steady and calm, though it cut through the thick air like polished steel. "I came here quietly to handle a matter of record. I asked for assistance respectfully. What I received was hostility, insult, and force. That is not how your staff should treat any customer, let alone one who holds part of the bank's foundation in her family's history." She let her words sink in for a moment, her eyes never leaving Victor's pale face. But perhaps I was naive to think dignity still resided in these walls. Every word landed heavier than the last. Customers looked away, embarrassed for having laughed earlier, some shifting uncomfortably as if complicit in the mockery. The tellers behind the glass no longer tried to hide their expressions. Instead, they stared at Victor, their earlier amusement replaced by unease and perhaps a trace of shame. Even the security guard who had chuckled earlier now stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it, fumbling for a response. He glanced nervously at the office door that led to the regional manager's space as though hoping someone else would intervene, someone who could undo what had just unfolded. But no one came to his rescue. The fracture of authority Grace settled into the consultation chair Daniel had offered, her movements deliberate and composed, while Daniel retrieved the scattered pages of her documentation. The old deposit slips bore signatures from decades ago, the faded ink still legible, names that were etched not only into the bank's records, but into the very marble of its founding. A notarized letter dated nearly 50 years prior bore the elegant signature of Eleanor M. Alston, Grace's grandmother, one of the silent partners whose funds had allowed Riverside Trust to open its first grand building downtown. Daniel scanned the letter quickly, his eyes widening as the words confirmed the system's alerts. This wasn't just a client with wealth. This was bloodline tied to the roots of everything the bank represented. Victor lingered, his usual authority slipping through his fingers like sand. For years he had ruled this branch with sarcasm and intimidation, carving out power through fear and mockery. He had dismissed the struggles of clients who didn't look the part, had ridiculed staff into compliance, had basked in the laughter of those too afraid to confront him. Yet in this moment his stage had collapsed. His words, once sharp, now stumbled clumsily against the wall of truth. His voice, once booming, faltered in the face of Grace's unshaken calm. The imbalance of power in the room had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. Daniel straightened the documents and placed them carefully on the desk. "Everything checks out, ma'am. Your account is active and in perfect standing. If you'd like, I can arrange a private consultation room for you to review the details in peace." His words carried both professionalism and an undercurrent of respect that had been missing since the moment she walked in. Grace gave a small nod. "Thank you, Daniel. That would be appreciated." She did not glance at Victor, did not need to. Her dismissal of him was more devastating than any pointed remark could have been. By simply refusing to acknowledge his presence, she reduced his authority to ash. Victor took a step forward, desperation finally leaking into his tone. "Ms. Alston, Grace, look, I didn't know. If I had known who you were..." Grace lifted her hand slightly, silencing him without even turning her head. "And that is the problem, Mr. Halden. Respect should not be contingent upon recognition. Courtesy should not depend on titles. If you cannot see the worth of a person without knowing their name, then you have already failed in your position." The weight of her words crushed the last fragments of his confidence. The customers who had laughed earlier now avoided his gaze entirely, unwilling to be associated with him. The staff behind the counters exchanged glances, their loyalty shaken. The security guard shifted uncomfortably in his stance, as if reconsidering the man he had once seen as untouchable. Daniel guided Grace toward a glass-walled consultation room at the side of the lobby. As they walked, the hush of the crowd followed them, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or clearing of a throat. It was the silence of realization, of recognition that they had witnessed something greater than a customer inquiry gone wrong. They had witnessed a fracture in authority, a moment where arrogance met dignity and was found wanting. Inside the consultation room, Daniel held the door for Grace. She entered with poise, settling into the chair as though she belonged not only in that room but in every room this bank had ever built. For in truth she did. And for Victor, standing frozen outside the glass, the reality was finally undeniable. He had mocked, shoved, and dismissed not only a client, but the very chairwoman of the institution he thought he commanded. Echoes of the past. When the glass door to the consultation room closed, muting the restless whispers outside, Grace allowed herself the smallest pause. For the first time that morning, her fingers unclenched from the leather folder and she set it gently on the polished table. Daniel sat opposite her, his expression a mixture of awe and careful restraint, as though he had just stumbled into the middle of a story too large to comprehend in a single telling. His training had prepared him to balance accounts, guide clients through mortgage paperwork, and sell credit products. It had not prepared him for the sudden collision of history, legacy, and raw human dignity that had just unfolded before his eyes. Grace leaned back slightly in her chair, her composure intact but behind her calm expression. Memories stirred like the turning of old pages. She thought of her grandmother, Eleanor Alston, a woman who rarely sought the spotlight but whose presence could silence even the loudest room. Eleanor had been one of the quiet architects of Riverside Trust's birth, providing critical capital at a time when the institution teetered between ambition and collapse. Few outside the board ever knew her name, and fewer still understood the depth of her influence. Grace had grown up on those stories, not grand tales of wealth and opulence, but the smaller lessons Eleanor tucked into her words: dignity before pride, patience before fury, and legacy before impulse. As a child, Grace had watched her grandmother walk into places where she was underestimated or outright ignored, only to reveal with one calm signature or one carefully placed word that she was the reason the room even existed. Grace remembered those days vividly, the quiet car rides home, the way Eleanor would tell her, "Let them laugh, child. Laughter without knowledge has no teeth. When the truth arrives, it silences everything." That sentence had carved itself into Grace's bones, and this morning, as she faced Victor's cruelty, she had felt those words humming through her veins. The shape of resilience. Daniel cleared his throat gently, pulling Grace's thoughts back into the present. "If I may ask," he began, his tone respectful but cautious, "how is it that your account is tied to the founder's class? I don't mean to intrude. It's just," he faltered, realizing how his curiosity might sound. "It's just extraordinary." Grace studied him for a moment. Unlike Victor, Daniel's question did not carry arrogance or suspicion. It carried genuine wonder, the kind that sought understanding rather than dominance. She nodded slightly. "My grandmother was one of the silent partners when Riverside Trust was established. She believed in institutions, not for the sake of profit alone, but for the stability they could provide communities. She didn't want her name in marble or headlines. She wanted to ensure that people, especially those who were often overlooked, could trust in something steady." Grace's voice softened, almost as though she were reciting a lesson long memorized. When she passed, she left instructions that her descendants would hold responsibility for maintaining the account, not just as a resource, but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity cannot be bought or sold. It must be lived. Daniel listened intently, his respect deepening with every word. He realized this was no ordinary client, no ordinary legacy. This was a living thread stretching back to the very foundation of the building around them. The folder she carried wasn't just paper. It was history bound in leather. Grace folded her hands gently on the table. "It is not easy," she continued, "to carry a name that people expect to shine while others work to dim its light. I have been mistaken for the help, ignored at my own family's charity galas, doubted in rooms where I had more shares than those questioning me. And yet I do not spend my time correcting people's perceptions. I let them reveal themselves. Because how someone treats you when they believe you have nothing tells you everything about who they are." Daniel felt the truth of those words reverberate within him. He thought of his own struggles. Being dismissed by older colleagues, being told he was too young to understand clients with wealth. He realized that what Grace was describing wasn't just her story. It was a lesson for anyone who had been underestimated. The fire beneath. Still waters outside the glass walls. Victor paced restlessly, his arrogance cracked but not yet surrendered. He threw occasional glances toward the consultation room, his expression tight as if trying to calculate some way to salvage his authority. The customers, however, had seen too much. Whispered conversations darted through the lobby, and eyes that had once followed his jokes now looked at him with unease, some with outright disdain. The theater of his dominance had collapsed in front of the very audience that once applauded him. Inside, Grace's composure had not faltered once. But beneath her calm exterior there was fire, not the fire of vengeance but of conviction. She had endured years of subtle and overt dismissals, moments like this multiplied across boardrooms, schools, and neighborhoods. And each time she had chosen restraint, chosen silence, chosen to carry herself with dignity. Yet that did not mean the heat within her was absent. It meant it had been tempered into something far more enduring than rage: resilience. She turned slightly toward Daniel, her eyes steady. "Tell me," she asked, "when you saw what happened earlier, when your manager mocked me, when he shoved me, why did you step forward when others did not?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because it was wrong. Because even if you had no account, no papers, no wealth, it was still wrong. Respect shouldn't be a privilege. It should be the foundation of everything we do here." His voice grew steadier as he spoke. I don't want to be the kind of man who stays silent when someone is treated unfairly. Grace studied him for a moment, then allowed herself the faintest smile. Then perhaps there is hope for this place yet. Her words carried no bitterness, only measured acknowledgement. Yet they struck Daniel like a benediction, affirming not only his choice in that moment but his purpose as a professional, perhaps even as a man. The legacy she carried was not only one of wealth but of values forged across generations. And though Victor still lurked outside, desperate to regain control, Grace knew the truth was no longer hidden. Her grandmother's account was more than numbers on a screen. It was a mirror that exposed character for better or worse, and that mirror had just revealed a fracture that could not be ignored. Cracks in the facade. The atmosphere in the branch had shifted irreversibly. What had once been a lively lobby of chatter and routine transactions was now subdued, weighted by the memory of what had just transpired. Victor Holden stood near the counter, restless and pale, every inch of his tailored suit now feeling like a straitjacket. For years he had cultivated a persona of dominance, presenting himself as the immovable center of the branch's authority. But now, with just a few words in the glow of Daniel's computer screen, that facade had cracked. The people who had once chuckled at his jokes or bent under his criticism no longer seemed amused. Their silence pressed on him heavier than mockery ever could. Victor tried to compose himself, straightening his tie, tugging at his cuffs, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. His reputation had been built on certainty that he was always the cleverest in the room, the sharpest, the untouchable manager whose word was law. Yet the sight of Grace seated calmly in the consultation room, her folder resting on the table as if it had never left her hands, gnawed at his authority like rust on iron. He wanted to barge in, to reclaim control with a booming voice and cutting words, but the memory of that 8-figure balance blinking on the screen made his tongue heavy, and his confidence falter. The customers waiting in line avoided his gaze, whispering quietly amongst themselves. Some shifted impatiently, eager to see what would unfold. Others simply studied him with subtle disapproval. Even the staff behind the counters glanced toward Grace's direction, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. They had never seen their manager silenced, never seen his confidence stripped away so thoroughly. For the first time, they realized that perhaps the power he wielded had never truly belonged to him at all. The voice of truth. Inside the consultation room, Grace remained composed, her calm presence filling the space more than any raised voice could. Daniel sat across from her, still steadying himself after the weight of what he had discovered. He knew he was no longer handling a routine account inquiry. He was standing at the edge of a revelation that would ripple far beyond the walls of this branch. Grace finally spoke, her voice low but resonant. I had hoped this could have been handled quietly. Discretion is a value I've always admired in this institution, but perhaps it was necessary for the truth to be laid bare in this way. She opened her folder again, sliding across the notarized documents that bore the Alston name and the seals of the bank's earliest days. The ink may have faded, but the authority of those words had not diminished. This account was never meant to be used as a symbol of superiority. It was meant as a safeguard, a cornerstone to remind this institution of its duty to treat all people with fairness, regardless of appearances. That was my grandmother's vision. She believed banks should be pillars of dignity, not theaters for arrogance. Daniel studied the documents, his breath slowing as he read the careful script of Eleanor Alston's signature. Every line carried weight, not simply because of what it represented financially, but because of the principle behind it. Your grandmother, she wasn't just a silent partner, he said softly. She was a guardian of values. Grace inclined her head. Exactly. And today when I walked into this branch, I saw how far that vision has strayed. A manager who mocks a client, who shoves someone he believes has nothing, who thinks respect is reserved for those who walk in with polished shoes and expensive suits. That is not the legacy she left behind. That is not why Riverside Trust exists. Daniel nodded, the truth of her words anchoring itself within him. He realized then that this moment was not simply about correcting Victor's cruelty. It was about drawing a line between what the bank had become and what it was meant to be. The public unveiling. The glass walls of the consultation room could no longer contain the energy of the moment. Customers craned their necks subtly, staff whispered amongst themselves, and Victor's pacing grew more agitated by the second. Finally, Grace stood, gathering her folder in her arms once more. She gestured toward the door, and Daniel, understanding instinctively, opened it for her. As she stepped back into the lobby, the room fell into a hush. The sound of her heels against the marble echoed like a measured drumbeat, each step a declaration of presence. She did not need to raise her voice. The silence itself made her words audible to every corner of the room. "My name is Grace Eleanor Alston," she said, her tone calm but firm. "My family helped establish this institution, and I am one of the current chairpersons overseeing its legacy accounts. This bank was built on values of trust, respect, and service to the community. Today those values were mocked." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, briefly landing on Victor, whose face burned crimson under the weight of her gaze. "Respect is not a courtesy extended only to those who appear wealthy. It is the foundation upon which trust is built, and without trust, a bank is nothing more than walls and numbers." The impact of her words rippled through the lobby. Customers shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others staring at Victor with visible disapproval. A woman who had laughed earlier now looked down at the floor, shame evident in her expression. The staff behind the counter stood straighter, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and unease. They had just witnessed something they would never forget, a reminder that true authority was not loud or boastful but steady, principled and undeniable. Victor tried to interject, stammering, "Ms. Alston, if I had known—" "I never would have." Grace raised her hand slightly, cutting him off with the same calm authority she had shown before. "That is precisely the problem, Mr. Halden. If respect is conditional on recognition, then it is not respect at all. Your actions revealed not just a failure of judgment, but a failure of principle." The turning point, the weight of the moment, pressed heavily on Victor, but it liberated others. For the first time, Daniel felt a sense of clarity about why he had chosen this career. Banking wasn't meant to be about numbers alone. It was about people, about trust, about building bridges rather than walls. Grace's presence illuminated that truth, and he knew he could no longer see his work the same way again. Grace turned slightly, addressing the customers still seated or standing in line. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their balance sheet. That was my grandmother's belief. It is mine as well, and from this day forward, it must once again be the standard of this institution." Her voice did not waver. Her gaze did not falter. It was not a speech rehearsed for effect, but a truth spoken from conviction. And in that truth, the balance of power shifted permanently. The whispers in the room gave way to silence, but it was no longer the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of recognition, the acknowledgement that they had just witnessed something far larger than an argument between a manager and a client. They had witnessed the unmasking of arrogance and the reassertion of principle. Victor, once the loudest voice in the building, now stood diminished, his authority in tatters. No raised voice or clever remark could rebuild the image that had shattered. The laughter he once commanded had dissolved into shame, and in its place rose a quiet respect for the woman who had stood her ground with grace, patience, and unwavering dignity. And though the story of what had happened in that branch would soon ripple beyond its marble walls, those present already knew the truth. They would never forget the day Grace Alston revealed who she was. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a calmness that carried more power than any title ever could. The summons of authority, the air inside Riverside Trust's branch had turned heavy, like the stillness before a summer storm. Grace stood at the center of it all, her presence alone rebalancing the hierarchy of the room. She had not raised her voice, had not lashed out in anger, but the weight of her calmness had silenced the entire lobby. Victor Halden, once the swaggering center of attention, now shifted from foot to foot, his confidence unraveling with every second that passed. His eyes darted toward the frosted glass door that led to the offices upstairs, silently praying for someone with greater authority to intervene. But the irony was cruel. The greatest authority in the building was already standing before him, and it was the very person he had mocked and shoved. It was then that a new sound broke the silence, the clicking of polished heels descending from the staircase at the far end of the lobby. Heads turned as Margaret Rowe, the regional director, entered the floor. Her sharp suit, silver-streaked hair, and piercing gaze commanded respect wherever she went. Margaret was known for her intolerance of theatrics and her insistence on discipline. She scanned the room, her instincts immediately sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. Her eyes landed on Victor, whose forced smile betrayed the panic beneath. Then she noticed Grace, standing poised with her leather folder clutched firmly but calmly in her hands, and Daniel slightly behind her, pale but resolute. "Mr. Halden," Margaret said, her voice clipped with authority. "Explain." Victor cleared his throat nervously, the sound ragged and unconvincing. "A misunderstanding, ma'am. A client came in making claims and I was attempting to maintain order." Grace turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Order?" she repeated, her voice low but cutting. "You call mockery, dismissal, and physical aggression order?" The words carried across the lobby, not shouted but spoken with such clarity that no one could mistake them. Margaret's brow furrowed as her gaze snapped back to Victor. Physical aggression? The whispers that rippled through the lobby confirmed what she had just heard. The customers who had witnessed the shove now shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in affirmation. Victor stammered. She stumbled, that's all. It was nothing intentional. Daniel, his voice trembling but steady, interjected. "That's not true. He shoved her. I saw it." The weight of testimony, the silence of witnesses, and the calm authority of Grace's stance pressed against Victor like a closing vice. His kingdom of arrogance had shrunk to nothing, and now the very power he had wielded carelessly turned against him. The collapse of excuses. Victor's usual talent for controlling the narrative faltered in the face of Grace's steady composure and Margaret's piercing scrutiny. He opened his mouth, desperate to weave excuses, but the words tangled in his throat. "I didn't know who she was," he blurted, his voice higher than he intended. "If I had known—" Grace raised her hand, her calmness silencing him once again. "That is exactly the point. Respect that depends on recognition is not respect at all. Courtesy that is conditional is nothing more than performance." Her eyes never left Victor's face. "What you revealed today is not simply a lapse of judgment. It is the rot of arrogance that has no place in a position of service." Her words struck like hammer blows, not shouted, but delivered with the weight of undeniable truth. The customers who had earlier laughed at Victor's jokes now sat stiff, regret flickering across their faces. The staff behind the counters, once complicit in their silence, now looked down, realizing the ugliness of what they had enabled through laughter and avoidance. Margaret inhaled slowly, her posture rigid. "Mr. Halden, you are relieved of your duties pending formal review. Effective immediately." Her voice carried finality, the sound of a gavel falling. Victor's face twisted, torn between outrage and fear. "Margaret, you can't, after all the years I've run this branch." "You've run it into disgrace," Margaret cut him off sharply. "I've heard complaints about your conduct before, but this is inexcusable. And you've made that clear with your own actions, witnessed by half the lobby." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor's authority, once inflated like a balloon, now collapsed completely, leaving only the shriveled remnants of a man exposed. The mirror of accountability. Grace did not gloat. She did not smirk or revel in Victor's downfall. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the wider room, addressing not only Margaret but the staff and customers who had watched everything unfold. Her voice, steady and even, carried across the marble and glass. "What happened today is not about one man alone. It is about a culture that allows arrogance to thrive unchecked. It is about the silence of those who laugh when cruelty is disguised as humor. It is about the indifference that lets disrespect slide because it is easier than confrontation." Her words fell like stones into still water, each creating ripples that touched everyone in the room. "I do not stand here to humiliate anyone. I stand here to remind all of us of what this institution was meant to be. Banks are not built only on money. They are built on trust. Without trust, there is no stability, no dignity, no future." Her eyes moved slowly across the faces in the lobby. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded with quiet agreement. A man in line who had chuckled earlier now stared at the floor, his shoulders heavy with shame. A teller who had once suppressed her giggle now looked at Grace with wide-eyed respect, as though she were seeing a new standard she had never considered before. Victor, his face pale, muttered weakly, You're making a scene." Grace turned back to him, her expression calm. "No, Mr. Halden. You made a scene when you mocked a client and shoved her to the floor. I am making a point." The distinction landed with undeniable clarity. The seeds of change. Margaret, her arms folded tightly, took a step closer to Grace. "Ms. Alston," she said, her tone respectful now, "I trust you will want this incident documented formally." "There will be a full investigation." Grace inclined her head. "Do what you must. But understand that this is not about punishment alone. This is about ensuring that such behavior is never normalized again. What happened to me today may have revealed itself because of who I am, but I guarantee I am not the first person to be treated with contempt in this building, and that is what must change." Her words cut deeper than any reprimand could. Daniel, standing quietly nearby, felt a swell of admiration and a sense of responsibility at the same time. He realized that Grace's presence was not only a revelation of power, but also a challenge to everyone who worked under the bank's name. She was calling them higher, demanding that they see the humanity in every client, not only those with fortunes hidden behind worn folders. Margaret nodded, her jaw set. "You have my word, Ms. Alston. There will be change. And as long as I hold this office, the standard you just voiced will not be forgotten." Grace met her eyes, the faintest flicker of approval passing across her expression. "Then perhaps my grandmother's vision has a chance of surviving after all." The end of the old reign as security quietly approached to escort Victor from the premises. The weight of his fall settled upon the room. The man who had once strutted across the lobby like a king was now reduced to muttered protests and averted gazes. He tried to meet the eyes of staff he had once commanded, but they no longer looked at him with fear or admiration. They looked through him as though he had already ceased to matter. Grace, however, did not watch him leave. She turned her attention back to Daniel, who had stood at her side since the moment he chose to intervene. "Thank you," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but the sincerity behind it was undeniable. "It takes courage to stand up in a room full of silence." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry, but managed to nod. "It just felt like the right thing to do." Grace's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That is exactly why it mattered." And as Victor disappeared through the door, stripped of the authority he had once abused, the branch felt as though it had exhaled a long-held breath. The reign of arrogance had ended, and in its place, something new had begun, not yet fully formed, but seated in the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen dignity over vengeance, and in the courage of a young man who had chosen conscience over silence. The morning after. The following morning, the Riverside Trust branch did not hum with its usual rhythm. The marble floors gleamed as always, the tellers sat behind their counters, and customers queued with their folders and checks. But the energy in the room was markedly different. There was a quiet alertness in the air, as though everyone expected something unusual to happen again. The memory of yesterday lingered heavily in the space, whispered about in corners, discussed in low tones by customers who had returned specifically to confirm the rumor. The woman with the old folder, she was the chairwoman, someone muttered near the waiting seats. "She owns more of this bank than anyone else you see in a suit." Another voice, hushed but awestruck, replied, "She didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't even boast. She just stood there and made the manager look like a child." The story was already becoming legend, and legends have a way of changing the atmosphere they inhabit. Behind the counters, staff were quieter than usual. The tellers who had once laughed nervously at Victor's cruel jokes now sat straighter, their eyes flicking toward the entrance every time the glass doors slid open, half expecting Grace to appear again. And in the manager's office, the chair sat empty, its absence a visible reminder of arrogance unmasked and authority dismantled. Into that void stepped something else, curiosity, nervousness, and the faint spark of hope. Daniel, the young banker whose decision to help Grace had turned the tide, felt the weight of that change more than anyone. He had spent much of the night replaying the events in his mind, marveling at the calmness with which Grace carried herself. He had not only witnessed history, he had been part of it, and now he understood that the days ahead would not be business as usual. They would be different, because the return of Grace. It was mid-morning when Grace returned. The sliding doors opened, and once again her quiet dignity filled the space more powerfully than any uniformed guard or executive could. This time, however, there was no mocking laughter, no dismissive smirks. Instead, there was silence, the kind reserved for moments of reverence. Customers shifted respectfully, tellers straightened their jackets, and staff who had once smirked at her coat now looked down at their desks, embarrassed by their complicity. Grace did not revel in their discomfort, nor did she arrive to parade her power. She walked with the same measured pace, the same modest coat, the same folder pressed against her chest. Yet everyone understood instinctively that her presence was no longer a question of identity, but of authority. She moved toward the consultation room again, and Daniel, who had been watching from his desk, rose immediately to greet her. "Good morning, Ms. Alston," he said, his voice steadier now, touched by respect. "Good morning, Daniel," she replied warmly. "Shall we continue where we left off?" It was a simple exchange, but in that moment every staff member within earshot understood the shift that had occurred. She called him by name. She acknowledged him publicly. She treated him as a colleague, not an underling. The contrast with Victor's treatment of the staff was stark, and it did not go unnoticed. Seeds of reform inside the consultation room. Grace placed her folder on the table once more, but this time she spread its contents with deliberate care. There were account records, yes, but also handwritten notes from Eleanor Alston herself, letters written decades ago that outlined principles for how Riverside Trust should serve its community. One letter read, "If we are to last a century, let us not measure our strength by the wealth of our clients, but by how we treat the least of them who walk through our doors." Another carried the line, "A bank without compassion is a vault without purpose." Daniel read the words with quiet reverence, realizing that he was not merely looking at old paper, but at the heart of the institution itself. Grace tapped one of the letters gently. "This is why I came. Not to embarrass anyone, but to ensure that this legacy is not forgotten. I have seen how far some branches have drifted. Yesterday's incident was not unique, it was simply visible. My grandmother believed that the measure of any institution is how it treats those it thinks cannot give anything in return. That belief must be restored here." Daniel nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "What do you intend to do?" Grace folded her hands, her expression steady. "Begin with culture. Begin with training. Begin with reminding every person in this branch that dignity is not optional. It is the foundation. We will not fire our way to change. We will teach our way to it. Those willing to grow will grow. Those unwilling will reveal themselves." A conversation with Margaret. Later that afternoon, Grace met with Margaret Rowe in the regional office upstairs. The regional director had already taken swift action to suspend Victor and open a formal review, but she knew that Grace's involvement meant something more than discipline. Margaret, usually unflinching and stern, approached the conversation with uncharacteristic humility. "Ms. Alston," she began, "I want to apologize not only for what you endured, but for what it revealed about the culture under my watch. I believed Victor was firm but effective. I see now I was blind to the arrogance festering beneath the surface." Grace regarded her calmly. "It is not only about Victor. Arrogance thrives when silence permits it. Laughter at cruelty is a form of agreement. What I experienced yesterday was the result of many small silences adding up over time." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But this can change. It must change. If Riverside Trust is to remain a pillar of stability, it must first be a pillar of dignity." Margaret nodded, her resolve firming. "Then let us begin. Whatever resources you need, I will see it done." Grace leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I do not ask for resources. I ask for commitment. Commitment to retrain not only staff but leadership. Commitment to accountability, not just profit. Commitment to remembering that every balance sheet begins with a person. Can you make that commitment, Margaret?" The regional director met her gaze, unflinching this time. "Yes, I can." The staff meeting. 2 days later, Grace convened a meeting with the entire staff of the Riverside branch. The consultation room could not contain them all, so they gathered in the main lobby, the desks and chairs pushed aside to create space. The very place where humiliation had once echoed now became a hall for instruction. Grace stood at the center, her folder in hand, not as a shield but as a guide. She began not with scolding but with story. She told them about Eleanor Alston, about the quiet strength of a woman who had invested her wealth not for prestige but for principle. She read aloud lines from the letters, each sentence ringing with conviction that seemed almost prophetic. Respect must not be transactional. Dignity must not be conditional. Service must not be selective. Then she turned her gaze to the staff. "You laughed when cruelty was spoken. You stayed silent when dignity was denied. But you also have the chance to change. Each of you can choose whether this bank will remain a place of arrogance or become a place of trust again." That choice begins with how you greet the next person who walks through these doors. The room was silent, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of reflection. Daniel, standing among his colleagues, felt a swell of pride that he had acted when it mattered, but he also recognized the challenge Grace was laying before them all. This was not about one heroic moment. It was about building a new standard day after day. A new standard emerges in. The weeks that followed, subtle but undeniable changes began to take root. The tellers who once smirked at poorly dressed clients now greeted them with genuine courtesy. Daniel found himself mentoring colleagues on patience and listening, inspired by the example Grace had set. Margaret instituted mandatory training sessions rooted in Eleanor Alston's principles, sessions that emphasized not only technical skill, but also ethical responsibility. Customers began to notice too. Word spread that Riverside Trust was different now, that it treated every person with dignity, whether they walked in with a briefcase full of contracts or a single crumpled check. Grace visited quietly, never making a show of her presence, but each time she appeared, the atmosphere shifted. People straightened not out of fear but out of respect. They had learned that true authority did not shout, did not boast, did not shove. True authority was steady, patient, and dignified. And in that realization, they began to rebuild the culture of the bank piece by piece. Victor's absence became less a gap and more a lesson. His name was rarely spoken except as a cautionary tale whispered to new staff. The reign of arrogance had ended, and in its place, something sturdier was taking root, a culture shaped not by fear but by trust, not by pride but by service. And at the center of it all stood Grace Alston, not as a conqueror but as a guardian, carrying forward the legacy of her grandmother with the quiet strength of one who understood that transformation was not a single event, but a lifelong commitment. The silence of defeat. Victor Halden's world had grown very small. The grand office he once commanded was no longer his. The echo of his heavy laugh no longer filled the marble lobby, and the loyal nods of subordinates had evaporated the moment his authority collapsed. In the weeks following his suspension, he had retreated into himself, a man stripped not only of a title but of the illusion that title had granted him. The first mornings were the hardest when he rose automatically at 6, pressed his shirt, tied his tie, only to remember that he had nowhere to go. His mirror reflected not the invincible manager he had once believed himself to be, but a man whose arrogance had shattered against the wall of truth. The silence of his home was suffocating, and for the first time in years, Victor was forced to hear the voice he had buried under bravado, the voice of his conscience. He replayed the moment again and again, the shove, the folder spilling across the marble, the look of calm steadiness in Grace's eyes as he tried to humiliate her. He had thought it nothing at the time, just another day of asserting dominance in a building where he believed he was king. But in the quiet now, the memory struck him differently. He saw the shame in the faces of the customers, the disappointment in the staff, the cold precision in Margaret's voice as she relieved him of duty. Most of all, he saw the calmness of Grace, not gloating, not angry, but resolute, as though his cruelty had been less a wound to her and more a revelation of himself. And that was the deepest cut of all. The realization that the humiliation he had intended for her had returned to him 1,000-fold, and he had no one to blame but himself. The call from Margaret. It was a month into his suspension when Victor received a call from Margaret Rowe. The sight of her name flashing on his phone sent a cold wave through his chest. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but something in him whispered that running would not erase what he had done. He answered. "Mr. Halden," Margaret's voice was as clipped and steady as ever. "The board has concluded its review. Your employment at Riverside Trust will not be reinstated." Victor closed his eyes, the finality settling into him like lead. He had expected it, but hearing it spoken aloud stripped away the last shred of denial. However, Margaret continued, "Ms. Alston has made an unusual request. She wishes to meet with you personally before we close this matter." Victor's eyes snapped open. "She what?" "She asked that you be given an opportunity to hear her perspective directly," Margaret said. "She insists that redemption is not possible without confrontation, and confrontation is not complete without reflection. If you agree, the meeting will take place tomorrow at headquarters." Victor sat in stunned silence. Grace Alston, the woman he had shoved, mocked, humiliated. She wanted to meet him, not in court, not through lawyers, but face to face. His pride screamed to decline to avoid further shame. But another voice, the same voice that had haunted him in silence, told him this was the only chance he would have to stand in truth, however painful. "I'll be there," he said quietly. The meeting of unequals. The next day, Victor walked into the headquarters of Riverside Trust with none of his former swagger. His steps were slower, his shoulders lower, his eyes fixed on the polished floor as though afraid of what he might see reflected there. He was led to a conference room, not grand but dignified, where Grace was already seated, her leather folder beside her as always. She looked up when he entered, her expression calm, not triumphant. "Mr. Halden," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please sit." Victor obeyed, his throat dry, his hands restless in his lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, not oppressive but deliberate, giving weight to what would follow. Finally, Grace broke it. "You've had time to reflect," she said evenly. "Tell me, what have you learned?" Victor swallowed hard. His instinct was to reach for excuses, to justify his behavior with stress, with pressure, with ignorance of her identity. But those words tasted bitter now. He forced himself to speak differently. "I learned that I was arrogant, that I mocked people because it made me feel powerful, that I shoved you because I thought you were powerless, and I see now that it wasn't you I humiliated that day, it was myself." Grace studied him, her gaze sharp but not cruel. "Do you regret what you did because of who I am, or because it was wrong?" The question pierced him. He took a slow breath, the truth dragging itself from his chest. "Because it was wrong. Because if you had truly been powerless, if you had truly been someone with nothing, then what I did would have been worse, not better. That is what keeps me awake at night." Grace nodded once, her expression unchanged. "That is the beginning of understanding." Grace's lesson. Grace leaned forward slightly, her hands folded atop the table. "My grandmother believed in dignity as the first principle of service. She said that the way you treat the least powerful person in the room reveals who you are when no one is watching. That day in the branch, you revealed yourself. Not to me, but to your staff, your customers, your community. And now you live with that truth." Victor lowered his eyes. "I know. And I don't know if I can ever undo it." "No one undoes the past," Grace replied softly. "But one can choose what to do with the future. Redemption is not erasure. It is transformation. You cannot change what you did to me, but you can choose never to repeat it, and you can choose to use your voice differently." Victor looked up, startled. "My voice?" "You commanded attention easily," Grace said. "You know how to draw people in, to make them listen. That is a gift, though you twisted it into cruelty. Imagine if you use that gift to build rather than belittle, to lift rather than to mock, to correct rather than to crush. That is the redemption I speak of." Her words struck him harder than any reprimand could. He realized that what she was offering was not pity, not absolution, but a challenge, to turn his flaw into strength by reshaping its purpose. The offer of a second chance. Victor expected the meeting to end there, with words that would linger but no path forward. But Grace reached into her folder, pulling out a small envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside was not a contract, not a reprimand, but a letter of referral to a community outreach program partnered with the bank, designed to train former executives to mentor young professionals in underserved neighborhoods. The irony was not lost on him. He who had dismissed those he deemed beneath him was now being invited to serve them. "I am not offering you your position back," Grace said firmly. "That trust has been broken. But I am offering you the chance to rebuild yourself, to use what you know, what you can do, to help those who need guidance rather than ridicule. Whether you take it or not is your choice. But if you do, then perhaps one day you will look back on that day in the branch not only as your downfall, but as the beginning of your redemption." Victor stared at the envelope for a long moment. His pride resisted, whispering that this was beneath him. But deeper still, his conscience whispered that this was exactly where he belonged. With trembling fingers, he picked up the envelope. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Not because I deserve your forgiveness, but because I don't want the last chapter of my life to be arrogance." Grace inclined her head. "Then prove it, not to me, but to yourself." The first steps in. The weeks that followed, Victor began his new work with the outreach program. The first day was humbling, standing before a group of young adults who looked at him not with admiration but with skepticism. They knew who he was, Some had even seen the video of his humiliation that had quietly circulated online. But instead of posturing, Victor chose honesty. He told them the truth of his arrogance, the truth of his downfall, the truth of his confrontation with Grace Alston. He admitted his failures openly, not to seek sympathy but to show that change was possible even for those who had fallen furthest. To his surprise, they listened. Not all at once, not without doubt, but slowly, cautiously, they leaned into his words, and for the first time in his life, Victor realized that his voice carried power not because it made people laugh at others, but because it could help them see their own worth. Each session he led became a step not toward erasing his past, but toward transforming his future. He still woke some nights haunted by the memory of Grace's steady eyes. But now that memory drove him not to shame alone but to action. He was no longer the manager of a marble lobby. He was something rarer, a man learning humility. The circle of change months later, Grace visited one of the outreach events quietly, without fanfare. She watched from the back as Victor spoke to a group of young professionals about the importance of integrity, the dangers of arrogance, and the strength found in treating others with dignity. His words carried none of the cruelty she had once heard in him. They carried weight born of experience, of failure, of reflection. When the session ended, Victor caught sight of her in the doorway. For a moment, his face paled as though the memory of his shame had returned in full force. But Grace simply nodded once, her expression calm, approving. She did not need to speak. Her presence was enough. And in that silent acknowledgement, Victor understood that redemption was not a single moment, but a path, one he would walk for the rest of his life. And Grace, true to her grandmother's legacy, had given him the chance to walk it.